I think that the challenge is that colleges and universities just are not immune to sexual assault. We create these wonderful, rich um, communities, and yet, just like anywhere in a city or in a town, stuff happens. And so it's the institution's responsibility to work hard to prevent those things from happening, although we're not with individuals when these things happen, but to work hard to help people understand what consent means, and when somebody doesn't want to consent, or the fact that you can't consent if you're drunk. You can't consent if somebody is incapacitated. And so how do we educate people, students, about making informed decisions? I think the president's task force provides institutions and people who are committed to doing this work with actually more clarity and more leverage. And I think that task force took a very interesting stance, and that was to help colleges do the best work that they can. And so I appreciate that level of involvement through the highest governmental figure in the country, because to be perfectly honest, I don't think the majority of lawmakers really understand college campuses. I don't think they understand student culture and community. And I think there are complexities, like the difference between putting the responsibility on one member to say no, and as opposed to putting responsibility on both people to be sure they heard yes. I think the more national dialogue there can be, the better for college campuses. The more students are engaged in the dialogue on their own campuses, the better, because every campus has a different campus culture. And so I'm thrilled with the work that's happening at the government level, and I think there needs to be lots of continued conversation between higher ed as an entity and the government about how do we work together to really create a culture across the nation where consent is really understood, and where education and of men and women about their roles is healthy. When concerns came up from students about whether or not we had the greatest level of effectiveness in responding to sexual assault and preventing sexual assault, the president really articulated that Emerson was committed to always improving its programs and services for students. So as part of that initiative, we decided to do a few things. One, he formed a task force on sexual assault, which is made of faculty, staff, and students, who last year reviewed the college's programs and policies, especially related to sexual assault prevention and the prevention of other gender-based violence, for consistency with best practices. And that work resulted in a report that was forwarded to the president just a few weeks ago, near the end of the semester. And we will be examining the recommendations from that report this summer, and then making some actions that students will feel and see in the fall. We've hired a sexual assault advocate, a response advocate, who is Melanie Matson. Her official title is Director of Violence Prevention and Response. She comes to us from the University of Kentucky with great depth in prevention and response to sexual assault. She's already working on programs and clarifying policies and thinking about work that we'll do with incoming first-year students around education. The college also decided the best way to understand whether your policies and practices are good, in compliance with Title IX, appropriate, is to actually bring somebody from outside of your institution in. So we hired a professional service firm who are experts in campus safety. And they have done a pretty extensive review of all of the college's programs and policies related to Title IX, related to the Clery Act, and how we respond to instances of sexual assault. They're just about finished with their report, so it's like an independent review. And then once we receive that report, we will look at both the task force recommendations, the external review report, and then really create a strategic plan and action items that will lead to implementation of new programs and policies and practices with the goal of enhancing our services. I think that the challenge is that colleges and universities just are not immune to sexual assault. We create these wonderful, rich communities, and yet, just like anywhere in a city or in a town, stuff happens. And so it's the institution's responsibility to work hard to prevent those things from happening, although we're not with individuals when these things happen, but to work hard to help people understand what consent means, and when somebody doesn't want to consent, or the fact that you can't consent if you're drunk. You know, you can't consent if somebody is incapacitated. And so how do we educate people, students, about making informed decisions and taking care of one another? And on the other side, if something does happen, how can we assure that we can provide the highest level of support to survivors? So all of the work and the recommendations that will happen certainly this summer and next year and as we go forward are with those two focus areas in mind.